Okay, we are back in open session with the Human Resource Committee. Can't find my spot here.
It's number 8.
Number 8. Okay, looking at the Badger Conference compensation market. Who's taking that one?
I think Randy and I will kind of just share a little bit of, what's happening. Attached in the agenda is the press announcement that Sun Prairie School District put out, and really I think this was a fairly bold move by Sun Prairie School District, which has had an effect on the direction that districts across the county and in the Badger Conference, because there's obviously some overlap between those two things, directions that districts have taken. And I think what Sun Prairie makes mention of is their decision to offer to operate their compensation models as designed, and offer and also provide a 4.7% CPI increase to their systems. They specifically mentioned retention and recruitment of staff, and that certainly has resonated with the other schools in the area. Since this time, a group that I'm involved in, the Dane County Human Resource Directors, Dane County area, has met, and and the information that relayed is that really the majority of the districts have now recognized that in many degrees the market has been set, and they're working closely and to find ways to get their compensation systems to do the same thing. And then those are districts that we both geographically border in, those that we don't. That really the discussions have centered around 4.7 and operating compensation systems. And so at this time, I'm not aware of any other school districts that have settled or negotiated that amount outside of Sun Prairie, but that's kind of the information that everyone is working off of at this time. I know Randy meets with superintendents in the conference and area, and he's kind of guilty.
A similar type of conversation. I mean, you look in the Badger Conference, you have I think 4.7% is certainly something. Everybody watches kind of the CPI and what's happening at kind of their C level. And I think as that number was released, certainly that's generated some conversation amongst my colleagues. Everybody's in about the same place we are right now and trying to determine really where they're going to go and how they're going to move forward. But there was definitely a discussion point that trying to get as close to the 4.7% as possible was at least within the conversations that they were having within their districts. Some of it in response to kind of where other districts are, but also I think there's the whole piece with recruitment, retention of staff, and really being in a place where staffing is a huge piece of our operations, and wanting to make sure that everybody stays competitive within the market. So I think that's generally the high level conversations that we had. The meeting I had was probably attended by half of the Badger Conference superintendents. It wasn't an in-depth planning meeting, but it was definitely a piece just to kind of have a straw poll of where people were generally at. But I think it mimics some of the conversations that Brian's having with his HR peers.
Right, if you wouldn't mind, there's just something I wanted to point out in the Sun Prairie letter that I think as board members, it's something just to be thinking about. The letter talks about the approach that they're taking fiscally to provide a market competitive pay increase. If you can see, they're stating in their the 6th bullet point, they're doing so without a formal budget reduction process. So they're making the decision, by that statement, they're making the decision that we're providing the market competitive pay increases without cutting educational programs. So I think that's an important thing to note, because all school systems in Wisconsin could provide market competitive pay increases if they dive into their budget and decide they're gonna cut or reallocate A, B, C, D, and E, right? It's all about choices within a allocation of resources. So it's important to note that they're saying, we're doing this, but we're not doing this to get there. And then the second thing is that, you know, in their statement is they're saying our budget will be balanced for 2023, 2024. So they're coming out right now and they're saying, we understand by offering this market competitive pay, we don't have a balanced budget solution in 2022, 2023, but we will plan to present one the following year. So there's no question their district is going to have to analyze federal funding, state funding, and or local funding options through Operation Referendum questions. And they're getting out in front of it and they're saying, this is our priority. This is what we're going to do. We're not going to cut programs, and we're going to find our path to that balanced budget. So I think when you think about how they're framing this up, it's certainly a well-written communication to the public that is really identifying a priority of competitive pay, not eliminating educational programs, and that we will evaluate options to come up with long-term funding sources to match. That's their fiscal message that goes along with this. And I think it's just important to kind of reflect on that, that's the approach that they're taking. And in a market where we are all, you know, looking to be at market competitive, you know, salaries and benefits, it's important to understand what peer districts are doing. And in fact, a district incredibly close location wise to us. So kind of from a fiscal perspective, if someone asks, well, how are they doing this when we all know the state budget provided a permanent revenue cap increase of 0? They're coming out and they're saying, this is our position fiscally, and this is what we are intending to do. So just something to note.
And isn't it important that the last bullet is with the expectation that we're getting better state? And they put that out to the public.
Right, absolutely. Great point, Judy. I mean, they are identifying for their community that there is this excess funding currently sitting at the state level. And they do believe that at some point there will be a funding proposal to increase support for public schools. And so that's what they're looking at, you know, in conjunction really with, we will plan to present a balanced budget the following year. Obviously, it's a hope that the state budget situation looks better. It's an ability to manage the federal funds that they've been provided through various, you know, the various programs, and potentially a local option needing to be considered in the event that, you know, the state funding doesn't match with the belief system in Sun Prairie to provide competitive wages. Those are the strategies they're going to have. Those are the strategies that we have. You know, we have the same fiscal strategies available to us that they're looking at. So just thought it was important to just kind of see the message that they're getting out to their community. And as Brian said, that's definitely going to change, you know, or impact the approach that schools in Dane County and the Badger Conference is taking. And I will say it has caused me to be reflecting on strategies as well. I think this is something that we all have to take a look at and understand, you know, what are these approaches that area districts are looking at. And in the next agenda item, we'll talk about some of the work that Allie and I have been doing, you know, to talk about what could be our own approach that might be similar.
So that goes into the next point then, right? Compensation planning.
And so this is a circle back of the topic that we had visited about earlier. You know, we talked about 3 kind of general strategies. As I recall, what the committee had shared is certainly the one that they were interested in because of the recognition that it's of interest to our employees. And certainly the one that would resonate most positively with them was, the interest in item 2, which is, increasing systems by an inflationary measure and permitting staff advancement prior to the first paycheck. We did edit that a little bit, to reflect that one of the employee groups that we have is a negotiated group, the WTA. And so, in order for us to be able to do that, we would need to reach an agreement with them prior to that time. And the other kind of 2 options are different strategies. That would also certainly be received in different ways. The budget planning options, which I think I'll kind of feed back to Steve, kind of speak to a little bit of, as we look at all of our employees and we look at how we can both operate the compensation systems that we have and or what it would look like to involve that inflationary increase. Those numbers are factored in, and I'll really let Steve and Allie kind of explain what the work that they've done here.
Thank you, Brian. So this is what you see on the screen is going to be the focus of the budget committee meeting tomorrow as well, to talk through our fiscal approach really between March and July 1st. And then how does that tie into what the board's fiscal strategy is? And I put the date November 8th, which is the date of a possible fall referendum. So this document is 3 columns. The first one references 21-22. Second one references July 1st of 22-23. The third one references November 8th. And again, the meaning for that is more operational referendum related. So in the 21-22 column, I think it's important to note that there are financial strategies that the board could be considering between now and the end of June that would allow us to, I'm just going to say, build up some funds. Some of those larger strategies include not making our payment to our Fund 73 Employee Benefit Trust Fund, which again, I'd be happy with the full board or either committee to dive deeper into what that would mean. Another one is you see building department budgets. So the board has had a philosophy in the recent past of allowing unspent budgetary funds to remain at the level. So let's say high school didn't spend 100,000. It has remained in the high school carryover as funds available to use the following year. Our carryover funds in general are at an all-time high. Entering this year, it was over $1 million in total between all of the buildings and departments. Given the fact that circumstances have changed, which is we are dealing with a state budget that's provided a $0 permanent increase in the revenue limit formula, I think it's a worthy discussion of the board this spring to consider pausing that approach and capturing those dollars back at a district level for district priorities that we'll talk about in that middle column. So if you look at the far left, the 21-22, if Rebecca, if you could slide down to the bottom, a few of the strategies that we've identified could potentially result in us having, let's say, almost $1 million available as we move into the next fiscal year. These are just ideas. The ideas could be increased. Here's another idea. The board could implement a spending freeze. The board could simply say for the remainder of the spring, if an expenditure is not related to classroom instruction, right? So something that a teacher needs to teach this spring, we are not going to approve it because we have other priorities, higher priorities, like compensation systems for the summer. I'm only throwing that out there again, is these are all things that can be discussed. If you remember, as we were talking through like the early retirement discussion, we were throwing out ideas. Board members had feedback, we tailored it, we made changes, we made revisions. The point of all of this is we're throwing out ideas that ultimately board members' feedback is important to make sure that we could put together an ultimate plan that everyone believes in. So the building department budget number, that can get larger. The $1 million that's sitting in fund balance that's been previously allocated to buildings and departments, ultimately, all of that money is under the control of the Board of Education. You can move that money as you determine. So as an example, if a compensation strategy was deemed to be a higher priority than funds sitting in carryover for buildings and departments, the board absolutely has the ability to move money from one place to another. So just keep that in mind. What we've put in there is a relatively small $250,000, which would be very easy for us to reach that through just several strategies for the remainder of the spring. So first column is we could come up with $1 million, we could come up with more, come up with less. But I do think any fiscal strategy that we consider for July 1st, it makes sense to have a matching goal of saving that money by June 30th. So that's kind of why that first column is identifying a strategy of wherever we might end up with in a deficit in the July 1st column. It makes a lot of sense for us to consider how do we come up with those dollars between now and the end of June. Okay, so the middle column has a strategy. The July 1st column shows a strategy of strategy 2 that Brian referenced earlier, which is what we utilized last year, which is an interest in reaching agreement with the WTA before the first paycheck and increasing the paychecks of the non-WTA members by an inflationary amount and or the compensation system that the board has already approved. So those numbers are in there. You see some of the other changes, many of them have been approved by the board already, like the special education at the high school, you've seen that, the summer school increase, you've seen that, the aquatic center, you've seen that, co-curricular programs, you've seen that. So not everything in this column is new. There's things you've already approved. There are some things that are new. But between a combination of delaying expenses, reallocating some expenses, and increasing other expenses, there is a pathway that could result in us having, I'll call it a temporary negative balance of about $750,000, which would be offset if we put a strategy in place between now and June 30th to save at least an equal amount. And then the column that's November 8th is really a larger discussion that's really connecting our long-term fiscal strategy and our capital referendum strategy to an operational referendum question. So ultimately, that far right column needs a lot of discussion at the board level. Ultimately, that far right column needs to be played out over multiple years, depending on the length at which the board thinks an operational referendum question should go for. So we didn't want to show you this right away and have it have like 8 columns on it. So we're trying to just focus on what's more of the immediate issue. But ultimately, that third column needs to be connected to a strategy that is supported by the board for the long term. And it needs to have the number of years that would be connected. Another example with this is if there is going to be a new building as part of a capital referendum question, the new building expenditures need to move into this document and they need to be placed in whatever year that school will be opened. And then the resources need to be lined up. So the intent would be to continue working on this over multiple years to make sure that we're able to present the total picture and be aligned with the board's long-term strategies. But in the near term, that column that is focusing between now and June, and that column that's kind of focused between, let's call it July, and when we would have an operational referendum, are more immediate decisions that the board would need to weigh in on. The one thing that I would add to this is we did have a discussion at Heritage yesterday. And Allie's already made a change this morning where we've inserted an additional first grade section at Heritage in this document. The reason for that is we are experiencing growth. You saw that we were experiencing growth in the student count from January. And that estimated growth for the fall is going to put both first grade and sixth grade in positions where those grades are going to be more likely lined up with the board class size policy maximum and will not be lined up with the optimal. So we want to bring forward for consideration both first grade and sixth grade. At Heritage, Dan and Danielle were taking a pretty deep dive into their sections and looking at various options. Same thing at the intermediate school. We certainly could make a decision now not to approve those two positions and continue to monitor the growth. And I will say probably 5 years ago, that's what we would have done, right, Randy? We would have just kept watching it because you could post a teacher position in June and be very comfortable that there were going to be high quality applicants in the pool. And so we're probably looking at a different decision-making approach today than we did 5 years ago. Because from Brian's lens, the sooner we get going, the more attractive candidates we have in the pool, the more candidates we have in the pool. So we are looking for feedback on that topic. This will be on the agenda for the board meeting on March 11th. Do we start making decisions to maybe hire instructors when it appears we're going to be hitting the class size maximum before we know we actually are? Or does the board prefer to take more of a cautious approach and wait, even though we do understand from an HR perspective that's going to be more challenging? So that's a decision that we think we should be making in March.
I have a couple of things here. I agree with everything Steve said. I also tossed in there, this was for my request, was to put in the assistant principal at Arboretum. That's a piece that I would split with on 4K. I would probably take some of the 4K principal duties out like Amy Johnson does and kind of combine those together. That gives Amy additional opportunity then to kind of expand some of the work she does in the C&I area, which I think is impactful across the district. Some things we've done with administrative ads, particularly as we kind of tied them in with referendum growth, is that we put those into the referendum. We hired them in the spring, but it has been really kind of not necessarily tied to our annual budget right away in the spring. We kind of put it into the referendum. As the referendum passes, then it gets rolled into that. Also with the full understanding that if the referendum doesn't pass, then we just have to absorb that and then kind of determine how we fund that moving forward in the subsequent year. But that's the strategy we've used with all of our APs that we've added really the last few years at Intermediate, Heritage, and Prairie.
Randy, can you comment on how the intermediate / middle school guidance would be split?
I think right now, Brian, you probably have as
Yeah,
much information that we have.
We have a shared, a shared role, so it's 1.5 in each building. What this would be is that we go to 2
Oh, good.
in the intermediate school, and we have 2 at the
That has
Middle
been
school.
something that came up repeatedly at that middle school level for
yeah.
sure.
And so
Yeah.
the reason it's posted as bold
One,
is
I
that
read it.
it's not determined
Where?
where this role would go.
Okay.
Just a little bit of background. We went through the process of looking at kind of a 3-year plan for staffing, then like a 3-year plan for equipment.
Yeah.
So these things would pull off, that first year of that 3-year plan is probably an $800,000 budget item. So this is just taking off a few of those items, also looking at the growth. And part of the vision that I've had as we kind of looked at administratively was looking at principal piece and kind of evening some of those things out, expanding some of our services. So that's kind of where those came from. That does not by any means accomplish everything on that first year plan. It's just taking a few of those key pieces that we've identified as we've gone through and met on this to at least insert them here so that we don't lose sight of that. Could be potentially things that as the budget kind of gets formalized, other things could get added if there's latitude to do so, or things get added for them for subsequent years.
And I think the biggest takeaway that we're looking for from this committee is to go back to Brian's question on the 3 paths. And this committee certainly indicated at a prior month that you thought path 2 would be the best path received by our staff, right? I had talked about the path of holding off on some of the decisions to the fall would allow us to have a greater understanding of the resources available to us. And obviously, since then, we've learned that other districts are implementing strategies to get them to what Brian had identified a month ago as option 2. Other districts are pursuing their version of option 2 and are looking to put that in place by July 1st. So the point of sharing that document was to say, we can also identify a strategy that gets us to that path 2. The strategy that we've identified does have reallocation in it. It does connect to an operational referendum strategy in it. It does connect to a strategy to seek to save funds this spring. And it does connect to a strategy of, again, investing in classroom instructors to keep class size down. So this would be, I'll call it our first draft of a strategy that ultimately the board members have to weigh in on as to what you are or are not comfortable with. For this committee, it's how does that line up with 1, 2, and 3 that we've outlined here, and what your feedback would be to the budget committee meeting that's tomorrow, because I know Judy, you have to go in 15 minutes. Do you feel that the budget committee should focus on pathway 2, should focus on strategies like what is described here? And should that be something we consider for the remainder of this spring, leading into, call it the July 1st column? And Randy's absolutely correct in saying that, there was the 3-year budget plan had a much larger number in it, right? And it's about where do you move these expenditures? In this strategy, we're moving compensation strategies to the forefront. We're moving other expenditures into the November 8th column, or potentially year 2 of an operational referendum question. So it's about, as a board, where do you see us going for the rest of the spring? Where do you see us going this summer? And I believe we're capable of putting strategies together to meet your goals. It's just making sure that we are all on the same page with what those goals are. In effect, Sun Prairie said they're doing their version of option 2, right? That's what they've announced. I don't happen to know if they put saving strategies in place for this spring or not, or exactly everything that they're doing. But in effect, that's what they're doing, is their version of strategy 2. We can construct our version of strategy 2 if that's an approach that the board is interested in doing. There are some things in there that would be different. I do think it's certainly appropriate for us to revisit the carryover approach to the building and department budgets. I think all of us in this room probably would agree that a long-term compensation strategy to keep our staff at a competitive wage is a greater priority than continuing to build up a carryover balance. I think everyone would agree with that. So if that's correct, that's a strategy that we could look at. Our Fund 73 is in a very strong position financially. You know, part of that is just reminding the board what that long-term strategy was with Fund 73 and where we're currently sitting today. We're not required by any state or federal law to fund it annually. We have been, but certainly in this kind of a fiscal environment, a pause is a very viable alternative, right? Or some kind of a pause. I know Jack has expressed an interest in making some type of a payment, so we could certainly do that. So it's looking at those strategies. And I think the takeaway for this committee with the meeting we have tomorrow is, I guess we'd like to know your feedback on, again, the 1, 2, and the 3, you know, your reaction to what Sun Prairie did and what other districts are going to be doing. And should we continue planning, or actually step up our planning to look at that pathway to?
I think pathway 2 protects our most valuable asset, which is the staff system. I think that's got to be our priority.
Absolutely. We have to put our money. It means even putting off, you know, when you look at Fund 41. is there anything-
I can't hear you.
Fund 41, our operational or our maintenance, you know, we have money that goes into there every year. And with an operation or with a capital referendum on the horizon, I mean, I think staying with number 2 and going down that path is where we need to be.
I agree with it as well. So, but I also agree that I think we do need to look at taking some of that money that wasn't spent back to the district. This process.
So does that give you directions, or we use something formal?
I think, Randy, should we ask the committee to make a motion on a preferred path, or just share that with?
I think we just share it as such, as the general consensus of kind of the conversation that happens here. It's obviously going to have to be a piece that we bring back through kind of the budget and the full board. So I think that's fine, but I think we were just looking for general feedback. I think that Steve and Ellie put together that planning document. Do you feel comfortable with that approach generally, as far as how we try to, because part of what we'll then do from that is we'd like to get going on some of those positions, because I don't want to be late in the market.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a piece right now. Joan and I are going to go through the agenda for the March board meeting. Right now, we just have a placeholder on there for positions for 22, 23. And we're going to include some of these in there as kind of early adopters to get out into the market.
As well as some of the retired.
Yes, there's some of those have already happened.
Yeah, actually.
Oh, those have already.
Yeah, we're, ones that have already come through are out there now. We've got other ones that are with the teachers' letters in hand. We post them as pending, but those are gonna, actually, I have a pile of them to approve in my email right now. that they're gonna go out probably today. And so we will have, yeah, we will have, and we'll add more as we go. So we'll have positions out there already.
So a strong recommendation from this committee is 2.
Keep finding that money, every closet.
So any other things before we adjourn?
To adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So, do we have an expected date for round 2 of the Brownies?
Let me see when I'm up
So
next here.
can we just,
I think it'll be a
can we plan
surprise. How
a
about-
date?
How about
I
that?
like surprise.